I hadn't promised the world I would be a vegan. I hadn't declared it from the rooftop like some deeply moral stance. I wasn't proselytizing veganism from some ethical high ground. I had just told myself that I was committed to listening to spirit, and I had received a message from spirit. And then I didn't listen, and I felt out of integrity. It can be hard in the midst of so much violence, oppression, and despair to believe in a just, loving, and compassionate world. I'm also clear that if ever we need a collective hold of that possibility, it is now. Mundane Miracles with Sonya Renee Taylor is a podcast where I share stories, reflections, anecdotes, and epiphanies from my daily existence in an effort to collect evidence that life is truly loving and kind, full of intention, guiding us all toward greater love, grace, and compassion, proving that if we learn to look and listen, we will hear and see that life is indeed unfolding for our highest good. Join me as I share evidence that life is happening on purpose with radical love in service of our highest good, even when it sucks, especially when it sucks.
When I let my grief take up all the space of 1,000 oceans that were washing over me every day, I have to say, I felt joy. I felt joy, oh boy. I felt unexpected, unusual, surprising waves of joy.
Welcome to Mundane Miracles with Sonya Renee Taylor, my weekly compilation of evidence that life is indeed unfolding with purpose, in radical love, in service of our highest good, even when it sucks. I'm so glad that you all are here. I'm glad that I'm here. If you notice, I'm talking to you in my PJs. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that. And I'm also talking to you with eyelashes and and other things, because I'm just getting done with the speaking engagement today at Vanderbilt University's Women's Center. It was really lovely. I do a lot less of these talks these days, and so it felt like I hadn't spoken out loud in ages. And it's probably been about a month, but it felt like it's been like 4 years. And so anyway, I had a great night. Thank you all so much for bringing me out, Vanderbilt. It was a beautiful night. Thank you all so much for supporting the work and supporting the evolution. I got to share for the first time in public about Mundane Miracles, and folks were excited and are going to tune in. And so I'm excited. I'm shouting you out, Vanderbilt. Thanks so much. Also, highlight of the day. Guess what it is, y'all? Guess what it is? It's Scorpio season. When I tell you that I feel like I am arriving at Scorpio season with the first 4 layers of my flesh shredded off, blood cascading down my knees, my thighs, my temple, my face, my knuckles are bloodied and raw, and I am pulling my limp, exhausted body over the threshold of October 22nd. That is what I want you to know that Virgo and Libra season did to your girl. It was rough. It was rough. And Scorpio season comes in like someone changed the set. It literally comes in. I got to the airport this morning and the shuttle driver was like, hello. Everybody complimenting on my dress. They were like, you look like the sunshine. And it was so clear. I mean, I also did have on a yellow dress today, but it was clear that we were in my season. And even though there's a sun squaring Pluto today, which I'm pretty certain I was feeling the most intense aspects of over the weekend. In my chart, Pluto is the ruler of my sun sign. And there's a way in which I could really just feel Pluto as in the planet of power, really inviting me back into my power today, inviting me to stop being a victim of the stars and instead be a co-collaborator with them. And, I think about that as in this idea of mundane miracles, right? Like the planets are there. They are just part of our existence. And yet they are a pivotal and intricate aspect of the unfolding of energy in our lives and in the world. And it's miraculous that we are made up of the same materials that these planets are. And it's so mundane in some ways. It's so, but of course. And so if you've noticed, we're in episode 3, and I think I've talked about astrology and all of them. So indeed, Mundane Miracles does include and will include conversations about astrology because I find it to be such a powerful tool. But today's episode, today's story, today's collection of evidence is all about the miracle of my becoming vegan. And what I want you to know is it is indeed a miracle. It took a wing and a prayer for me to become vegan. And I mean that as a chicken wing and a prayer for me to become vegan. It was quite the journey. It has been quite the journey. And I continue to learn more and more about it and learn more and more about what it has for me all the time. Every day, I'm learning more and more about this journey. And I am not a strict vegan, meaning things sometimes have cross contamination. Once a year, I eat a chicken wing. we'll talk. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's been an assignment that has been incredibly revealing about my own inner world and landscape and what life is trying to do through me. It really has been powerful. And so I'll take you back to the beginning. I was living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It was 2022. And I was going through it, y'all. And there'll be other stories from this time because it really was one of the pivotal moments in my most recent transformation. So many things came through in the course of like 3 weeks, which is how it happens for me. Like my Uranus is conjunct my sun, which means quickly, rapidly, unexpectedly, life changes very fast for me. And I was going through some of these quick and rapid, unexpected changes yet again. It wasn't like they had stopped. They're constant. And I had been thinking about going vegan. And actually, the truth of the matter is, I knew that I was going to go vegan. And I knew that I was going to go vegan because in 2020, which we will call the Great Collapse, and we'll talk about it in a later episode, but my whole life collapsed. Everything I understood about my life shifted in a matter of 5 days. And then I was on a very different path. And one of the experiences that I was having during that time was that I was being given very clear and auditory instructions from my ancestors, from spirit guides, from angels. At the time, I thought I was crazy, but that's neither here nor there. Thank goodness I had a therapist who was like, nope, you're just having an awakening. But one of the things that happened, I had a giant altar sitting in the center of my home at the time. And I was an avid coffee drinker, like avid, like ritualistic coffee drinker. I didn't drink a lot of coffee, but I had a cup every single day. I had it with heavy whipping cream and brown sugar, and I loved it. And it was probably clogging my arteries, but I really delighted in it. And coffee was always a ritual for me from childhood because my grandmother drank it every morning. And then when my mother and I would often have a cup of coffee together, and it was part of our connection to one another, particularly when we were moving through times of her sobriety or my desire for her to get sober and other things like that. Again, other conversations that we will have in a later podcast. But my mother and I would drink coffee together. And when I traveled, particularly when I was a poet, I would travel around the world and I would collect coffee mugs from where I went and I would gift them to my mother. And so when my mother died on October 19th of 2012, at the time of this recording, that is just 3 days ago, 4 days ago, 3 days ago, marked the 12th anniversary of her passing. And I inherited all the coffee mugs back. I got them all back. And I had this one specific mug that I had gotten from a diner in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And it was like sort of, beige coffee mug, but it had like red lettering and it looked like newspaper advertisements on the front. And I think it actually was like advertisements for local businesses. And you could buy this coffee mug. Shout out to people in Kalamazoo who know where I'm talking about. I can't remember the name of the diner at this point, but they had these coffee mugs. And I bought my mother a coffee mug. And, when I was in Kalamazoo the very first time, I was a poet, broke poet. And I was like sleeping on some other poet's carpet. It was the middle of the winter. It was freezing. I was very, very broke. I might have been performing at a venue for like $50 and trying to sell some CDs. That's how I was living back then. And so, procuring these coffee mugs for my mother was like quite a expenditure at the time. Not long before 2020, the great collapse, I was back on tour in the United States because I often would fly from New Zealand and go spend like 8 weeks in the US and work. And then I would fly back to New Zealand and I would stay for 4 months. And then I would go back to the US for a bit and work. And on one of my trips back, I found the diner that I went to. And this time I was going back and I was brought by a university. I was talking about The Body Is Not an Apology at the time. And I was no longer a broke poet. And they paid me very nicely to be there and talk about The Body Is Not an Apology. And I went back to that diner. And this time they had the same mugs, but they had blueprint, but it was the same sort of newspaper advertisement motif on the mugs. And I bought a mug in honor of my mother. And so I had these two mugs. And there was one coffee mug that had my mother's name on it, Terry. And then there was the red print, newspaper print coffee mug from Kalamazoo. And for the most part, those are the only two mugs that I would drink coffee out of every day. One of those two mugs. And I woke up this morning after the collapse when I was having very intense spiritual experiences, auditory messages, being awakened every night at 4 a.m. and told to drive to the ocean, like lots of intense stuff, which again, there'll be a full episode about that at some point. But this morning, I woke up and I went to make my coffee and I received the message, pour a cup for your mother. And so I got her favorite mug. I was drinking out of her mug that said Terry. And then I got her favorite mug and I poured her a cup of coffee. And then I heard put it on the altar. And I sat it on the altar. And then I heard no more coffee. And I was like, hold up. Wait a minute. Wait. Huh? What's this message? And that was the end of my life as a daily coffee drinker. And that's how quick those messages come. But the other thing I heard when I got that message is, like, I didn't even hear it. I felt it because this wasn't an auditory message. The place the coffee on the altar and no more coffee, auditory messages. But I was like, oh, they're going to make me go vegan. It immediately welled up in me. They're going to make me go vegan. And I was like, oh, please don't make me go vegan.
Hey you, hey you, hey you, hey you, hey you, hey you,
And I was like, look, I'm not ready to do that yet. I'm not ready. But I saw it as a foreshadowing. That moment when I was told to give up the coffee, I saw it as a foreshadowing. I didn't realize that it would be as abrupt and instructive as the coffee release was. Yeah, I was unprepared for that. So I had this inkling back in 2020, this premonition that eventually I would have to also give up meat and dairy. I am raised by Terry Lynn Johnson. Terry Lynn Johnson could cook her face off. When I tell you my mama could cook, if you talk to anybody who knew Terry, the first thing they would say about her is, oh, Miss Terry could cook. Oh, I miss her food. Like that was one of the most juicy elements of her beingness. She was a tourist son. And so she was here to feed you some delicious stuff and make things pretty and comfortable. Fast forward 2 years later, am living in a different house. I no longer have that giant altar. The auditory messages have quieted. They still come sometimes, but they're not very loud. And I am in a bit of another cycle of intensities. And I still have an altar room and I still have an altar and I sit down for my daily practice at my altar and I go into my room and I sit down. And it was like as soon as my butt hit the seat, I heard another auditory message and it said, if you want to survive what's going to happen next year, you'll go vegan. Y'all. All I can say is, I was like, well, I guess I'm vegan. There's a way in which I heard it and I was so afraid. It was such a scary and foreboding message that it never occurred to me that it was a choice. It never occurred to me that I had an option, really. I was like, I don't know what's going to happen next year, but I heard that my survival depends on veganism. So I guess I'm a vegan now. And that's the day I went vegan and I went cold turkey. And I didn't have any real experience. I had been a vegetarian for like a year back in 2010. And my downfall was fried chicken. I feel like we've spent a lot of time as Black people trying to avoid stereotypes. I have no desire to avoid the stereotype that Black people like chicken. We love chicken. We love fried chicken. And if you don't love fried chicken, what's wrong with you? Because fried chicken is delicious. Unless you have moral, ethical reasons for not engaging in the flesh of animals, which, I do, which I have now. But if you're a meat eater and you don't eat fried chicken, I'm suspect. I'm suspicious of you, friend. I love fried chicken. And so fried chicken is how I stopped being a vegetarian in 2010. Oh, fried chicken and a breakup, like, they go together. Anyway, I had a breakup. I ate some fried chicken. I wasn't a vegetarian anymore. And so in 2022, I'm thrust into veganism and I'm struggling, y'all. It is not an easy path at all. And here's why it wasn't easy. What would happen is I would get ready to eat something. I'd be out. And then, of course, there'd be limited options because I wasn't someplace necessarily where there was food. And I would have the most intense responses. Now, part of what was happening for me is, and this is, I think, an invitation for everyone who's listening, is the truth of the matter is we have a relationship with food that is not just informed by hunger. That's not the social context in which we do food, certainly in the Western world. Certainly in the United States of America, particularly here in Turtle Island, there are particular ways in which we relate to food, and it's social and it's cultural and it's religious and it's environmental and it's political. Food has so much tied into it, right? It's epigenetic. And when I was thrust into veganism, what I was really thrust into was an aggressive, abrupt, and very sharply focused orientation around my relationship with food. And there were things that were hiding in that relationship that I would have never seen if it were not for the fact that I all of a sudden was eating in such a way that it required intentionality to feed myself, intentionality about where I was going, intentionality about what was available. So I had this one time where I was out with a friend and we were on our way to go look at a house. I was getting ready to move. I was anticipating my lease was getting ready to be up. So we were out and I had not eaten. I had eaten something for breakfast, but while we were out, I was definitely noticing that I was starting to get hungry. And my friend was like, are you going to be okay? And I was like, yeah, I think I'd be okay, but we should probably go now. And so we went to a location to get food. And as we arrived, the kitchen was closed. And they were like, sorry, the kitchen's closed. And so then We went to another location and they also didn't have anything for me. So lastly, we get to a food court. And now I have to like scour a multitude of restaurants to figure out what I'm going to eat. And it's at this point that I just lose it. I lose my shit. And what's happening is that underneath my way of eating before, lurking underneath there was an embodied experience of food insecurity from my childhood that I never had to look at because food was abundant and always there. And I made it a point to make sure the food was always there. And so I didn't have to look at the food scarcity story that was living underneath my eating habits. And so I feel like my body tells me that I'm going to starve because I had the experience of going hungry as a kid. And so I'm sitting in this restaurant across from my friend and I'm in full trigger and I'm weeping. And I could feel, bless her heart, shout out to Bro Johnson, one of my really dear friends, who was really able to just lovingly and gently hold me energetically in that process and witness me as I moved through that story that was bubbling to the surface as a result of the particular conditions. And that was what the first 6 months of my vegan journey was like being confronted with what was hiding underneath all of my food choices. So after April, I leave New Zealand. I go to the States. I think I'm just going to the States for 5 weeks to do some work. I haven't been back to New Zealand since April of 2022, y'all. So we'll talk about that another point too. But apparently I was energetically kicked out of the country. But I go home to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to go visit my family, and it's Easter. And I say that I'm going to have the holiday meal catered so that everyone can go over to my sister's house and we'll all have dinner together and be together there. And I arrange the caterer and I order all the food, and my family are not vegans. They act suspicious if you just offer them something that doesn't have meat in it. They act like you cook them something weird. Like they don't eat things that are not of flesh in other contexts. One of my best friends, childhood best friends, was vegetarian long before any of us were, like early adopter vegetarian. And she would go to my mother's house, and my mother would be like, is she coming over for dinner? And I'd be like, yeah, mommy, she's coming. She'd be like, oh, good. Well, I only put turkey in the greens. And I was like, mommy, turkey is meat. It's like, turkey ain't no meat. And I was like, turkey is absolutely meat. My point is that sometimes Black people disinclude chicken and turkey as meat. It becomes some other thing. And so, anyway, I'm in my city of origin with my family. We are preparing, and I go to pick up the catering order. And of course, there's a giant steaming pan of fried chicken in the back of my truck, and it's wafting into my nostrils, and I can barely function. And I'm having a crisis of conscience. It's like the wing is taunting me. Like it's like, you're gonna eat me. And I'm like, I want to eat you. Do I really want to eat you? But I shouldn't eat you. And then I felt my like willful, I'm gonna eat a piece of chicken. And so I go to the back and I take out a chicken wing and I eat this chicken wing. And I don't feel sick. I don't feel ill. I don't feel any of those things. I feel like I betrayed myself. I feel like I didn't honor what I had promised myself I would do. And it was this moment where I felt the sting of being outside of my own personal integrity. I hadn't promised the world I would be a vegan. I hadn't declared it from the rooftop like some deeply moral stance. I wasn't proselytizing veganism from some ethical high ground. I had just told myself that I was committed to listening to spirit, and I had received a message from spirit. And then I didn't listen, and I felt out of integrity. And it was enough to be like, okay, you're going to do this because you said you were going to do this. That's it. No other reason. You're going to do it because you said you're going to do it. And so I continued on being in this vegan journey. I still would have utter meltdowns. And one of the things that I think was energetically happening is that I would be repelling food in some ways. Like my subconscious belief in food insecurity was absolutely making food difficult to get to. Things would happen, all kinds of stuff would come up. One of the things that came up consistently is I would tell myself that I had to eat this thing, whatever it was. And then that was the only thing that I could make myself eat. It was the only thing I could wrap my brain around. And it would send me into such emotional turmoil and distress when the thing I thought I was going to eat couldn't happen. And I would like almost forget how to just nourish myself. And these breakdowns, I kept having these breakdowns where I would get stuck and I wouldn't be able to nourish myself. And part of what was happening is that I wasn't being allowed to food fix, right? It'd be like there is an emotional thing underneath the surface, and you are reaching for your own sense of control through food. And this dietary arrangement that you have right now makes that not possible to reach to it through food, which means you just have to let it come up. And so much stuff would bubble to the surface. But one of the most sort of compelling pieces is I had tucked in the back of my brain the if you want to survive, what's going to happen next year. But I started having an inclination that I needed to know. And one of the things that I knew was lurking, but I hadn't paid specific attention to was my blood pressure. My grandmother had hypertension on both sides. Black people have disproportionate rates of hypertension. We also have disproportionate rates of stress. And I had gone to a couple of doctor's appointments over the years, and they would regularly comment, "Oh, your blood pressure is a little high. Oh, your blood pressure is kind of high." But nobody was diagnosing me with hypertension. They were just telling me my blood pressure was a little high. And I was like, there's something going on here. Probably. I should probably look at it. And so I got a blood pressure cuff and I started taking my own blood pressure. The first time I took my blood pressure, it was like 164 over 98. Something outrageous, 101. The current average blood pressure, healthy blood pressure is something less than 120 over something less than 80. So 120 over 80 or lower is normal blood pressure. Mine was 164 over 101. It was wildly high. And I knew that there was something that I needed to tend to. But by that point, I was like, well, I imagine that whatever the thing I need to survive is might have to do with this blood pressure. And so I started researching what do I need to do to get my blood pressure down. And I was really resistant to going on medication. I knew that it could do things to my kidneys and it would have other adverse effects. And I also just have a healthy suspicion of pharmaceutical companies and the ways in which they make us dependent in many ways. There are times when medical pharmaceutical intervention is necessary and needed. And for me, I want to exhaust all of the other options before I take that route. And so I found myself in Costa Rica and I found myself on an ayahuasca journey. And literally, I found myself is the best way to describe that. And again, how that all unfolded is an episode for a later date. But I received a message in my ceremony. And what I was told in my ceremony was that I was going to have a mild stroke and that it was my body's way of releasing all of the pent up intensity that I had collected over the years. And there was also a manifestation of my ancestors' experiences of intensity and stress. What I want you to know, mundane miracles, is that when I sat down and I heard that message, I couldn't have known that, right? I couldn't have known that 5 or 6 months later, I would be given a very clear reason why I needed to go vegan, that I would have it explained to me. And of course, after I came out of my ceremony, I asked the shaman who was holding the container for the ceremony, if you receive a negative, quote unquote, bad, quote unquote, message from the medicine, is it inevitable? And he said to me, no, you're being told that for prevention. You're being told that so that it doesn't happen. And I immediately was like, well, what we're not going to do is have a stroke. Now that I've been told there's an option, what we're definitely not going to do is have a stroke. And I ended up being hosted after my ceremony, after my ayahuasca ceremony. I ended up being hosted by the beautiful Amina, who at the time lived in Costa Rica and does beautiful erotic embodiment and reclamation work. Tantra ATL is her organization. But they hosted me for a few days after I came out of my ceremony in Costa Rica. And she just so happened to have an old friend who helped coach people in getting off of hypertension medicine and bringing down their blood pressure naturally. She just so happened. And I ended up exchanging information with this person and going back and forth. His name is Larry. And he did it through a salt and oil free diet. But basically, that salt and oil free diet was an intervention that could dramatically lower your blood pressure without needing to go on medication. And I started doing what he suggested, again, with as much grief and angst as I had when I first started going vegan. Each thing was a layer and another layer and another layer. It was like, great, you looked at that. What's underneath that? Great, you looked at that. What's underneath that? Great, you looked at that. What's underneath that? Life was distilling me to the center of my story. And it's one of the characteristics of Scorpio is that it wants to go to what is underneath. And that's what life was moving me toward. What is really at the bottom of this thing? And at the bottom of it was the story of lack, the story that pleasure only lived in one location and it was on my tongue. The story that there was a separation between what my mouth wanted and what my body wanted, and that I was going to always listen to what my mouth wanted and never listen to what my body wanted. It was the story that I needed to hoard, right? I needed to hoard whatever little bit I could get because I didn't trust that there would be something there later. And all of that was living underneath a chicken wing, a salty, crunchy, crispy, fried in oil chicken wing. And I never would have seen it if it wasn't for that abrupt, intense message that I needed to shift, that I needed to change, that I needed to do something drastic. And in doing that, I really did begin to transform my life and my relationship with food. Today, I'm a joyful vegan who cooks all the time for my friends and makes veganism actually like tasty and exciting. You know, I have reincorporated oil and salt in my diet, but as minimally as possible, and I season in other ways that make the food rich and delicious. I ultimately did go on blood pressure medicine. The lowest dosage, it's 5 milligrams. It's a very tiny, teeny, tiny pill. But it was because I didn't want to live in that level of restriction. I saw what I needed to see, and I intentionally reoriented my life to a healthier, more intentional lifestyle. And I realized it was okay to get help. It was okay to say, I've done what I can do on my own without making myself miserable and cramping my and like siphoning off my own social opportunities, which was really important at that time because I was just traveling the world.
Hey you, hey you, hey you, hey you, hey you, hey you,
And it was, it was hard to be traveling the world and not have the thing that people are often most excited about traveling the world to do, eat the food. It was wild to not have that be the center of my experience, but it made so many other things the center of my experience. It made the land the center of my experience and the people that I encountered the center of my experience and the spiritual wisdom that was being imparted to me in those locations the center of my experience. And the food was an aside that sometimes was really yummy and sometimes really mediocre. And I learned to nourish myself and to choose nourishment over comfort. And that sometimes nourishment just meant put food in your body, not the food you think you want, not what your taste buds are craving, not the thing that's going to make you happy. Food in your body. Nourish yourself. And it also made me aware of the ways in which our food systems are not designed for nourishment in the United States. And I felt fiercely protective of my own well being. I felt like, oh, y'all not going to kill me. I felt it strongly after that experience. It was so clear that life was not punishing me and taking away my opportunity to have delicious food. Life was saying there is a deeper understanding and wisdom for you. You want to know you more deeply. And in order to know you more deeply, you have to be willing to look in the places that you've not wanted to look. And if you look, and if you're intentional, then you'll see what could be on its way before it ever has to arrive. You can ward off danger by being willing to look your fear and your stories of lack straight in the eye. And, what a blessing. As of this date, I have not had a stroke. I pray that I will continue to be on the path that does not have a stroke in my future. And I am a far more intentional and attentive being because of that journey that felt like utter deprivation, y'all. And it's beautiful to be on this side of it and see that it wasn't deprivation at all, that it was actually life in its generosity, in its kindness, in its radical love, unfolding in service of my highest good, even if it sucked. And it's a lesson that, every day I sort of barely hold on to it. Every day I do think about meat. I still miss meat, but it doesn't make my whole being feel good. It feels good on my tongue, but I'm a more integrated being than I've ever been before. And I want my whole being to be a yes. And so for today, still a vegan by a wing and a prayer. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that you will continue to like, subscribe, listen, make it a ritual that you too collect evidence with me that life is indeed happening on purpose, in radical love, in service of our highest good, even when it sucks. I'm Sonya Renee, and this is Mundane Miracles. Please do tune in and subscribe and tell your friends. Have an amazing one.
You think you are dying, but you are being born.
Mundane Miracles with Sonya Renee Taylor is produced by Sonya Renee Taylor, edited by Dr. Shannon Weber. Our opening music is Joy and Grief by Sean and Abigail Bingson of the Bingsons. Our closing song is Dying by the Bingsons. Join us in the ritual of collecting evidence by rating, commenting, and subscribing to Mundane Miracles on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. You can get early access to episodes and support our radical love work by becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Sonya Renee Taylor. That's patreon.com/Sonya Renee Taylor.